They called her Little Laura. The overhead pager crackled it once, twice, 3 times a shift, and the nurses on the 3rd floor thought it was funny. A way of keeping someone small when they started to look too competent, too capable, too much like they belonged in a space they had no business occupying. Laura Bennett moved through Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah like a shadow cast by fluorescent lights, present but unremarkable, visible but unmemorable. Her scrubs were always pressed. Her blonde hair pulled back so tight the skin at her temples stretched flat. She was never late. Never loud. Never complained. The day shift didn't know her last name. The residents couldn't place her face outside the hospital. The only thing anyone could agree on was that she worked the trauma bays on overnight rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., where the wounded and broken arrived in ambulances that screamed through the parking lot like metal birds of prey, and where the smell of antiseptic mixed with copper blood and something darker, the smell of fear, wet and sharp. The fluorescent lights buzzed above the ER entrance like insects trapped in glass. Laura clocked in at 10:11 p.m. on a Tuesday, scanned her badge, and moved through the double doors into the controlled chaos of Bay 4. A 73-year-old man with chest pain was being prepped for EKG. 2 teenage boys from a car accident waited in Trauma Room 2. The waiting area held the usual Tuesday crowd: flu symptoms, migraines, a woman with her arm wrapped in a dish towel soaked through with blood. Laura didn't walk to the break room like other nurses. She walked to the supply closet first, organized the crash cart, checked the defibrillator pads, confirmed the 4 lines were stocked. The night shift knew, if you needed something before the crisis hit, you found Laura Bennett already holding it. She moved with the kind of fluid precision that comes from having calculated movements in spaces where hesitation meant death. That was the thing about her that made people uncomfortable. Not what she did. How she did it. Like she had rehearsed this 1,000 times. Like muscle memory lived deeper than conscious thought. Dr. Marcus Ashford arrived at Cedar Creek Medical 6 months ago. Harvard Medical School. Chief of Emergency Medicine. Board certified. Published. The kind of man who kept his credentials on business cards and his voice sharp enough to cut skin. He was 47, with graying hair that he styled carefully and a watch that cost more than 3 nurses made in a month, a Rolex Submariner that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a weapon. The first time he saw Laura was during the Tuesday night trauma surge. A motorcycle crash. Driver ejected. Compound fracture of the femur, possible internal bleeding, consciousness sliding. Ashford was the attending. Laura was the charge nurse. He stood in the doorway of the trauma room watching her work, watching her move between the patient and the vital signs monitor without wasted motion, watching her anticipate what the residents would need before they knew they needed it. A 14-gauge needle. Pressure gauges. The phone line to surgery. She had everything. She was ready. And Ashford's jaw went tight. Not because she was good. Because she was good without asking permission. Good without needing his validation. Good without any of the credentials that had cost him 8 years of his life and $300,000 in student loans. 2 weeks later, it happened again. A facial laceration came through the ER, drunk college student, broken beer bottle, a cut that ran from temple to jaw. Ashford wasn't assigned to it. A plastic surgery fellow named Dr. Reston was covering. Reston looked at the laceration and called it a cosmetic repair, said it could wait until morning, said the emergency department wasn't the place for that kind of finesse. He left. And Laura stood in the room with the bleeding student and the quiet certainty that waiting meant scarring. She sutured it herself. Not the full repair, that was true to scope. But the deep layers. The precision work. Tissue approximation that would matter in 6 months when the scar would be invisible or visible, thin or thick, acceptable or ruined. She worked with a magnifying lamp and a 6-0 absorbable suture, and her hands didn't shake. The resident watching from the hallway said later that it looked like watching someone disarm a bomb in real time. Perfect. Methodical. Like confidence had bones. Dr. Ashford was in the hallway when Laura finished. She didn't see him at first. He was standing in the shadow between the light fixture and the supply cart, watching her emerge from the room with the used suture kit, gloves peeled off and tucked in her pocket. Their eyes met for maybe 3 seconds. His expression went from cold to something colder, calculation with edges. That night, he made a phone call to the hospital administrator, a man named Peterson who had hired Ashford and was protective of that choice. Ashford's voice was measured. Professional. Concerned. "I'm seeing some scope drift in the nursing staff," he said. "Some of the overnight nurses doing work that's beyond their training. Creating liability. I thought you'd want to know." Peterson listened. Listened and believed. Because Ashford was Harvard. Because credentials were currency. Because a doctor's concern about a nurse overstepping was the kind of problem that kept hospital administrators awake at night. Beneath Laura's scrubs, tucked against her sternum where the fabric could hide it, hung a single dog tag on a broken chain. The tag was military-issue stainless steel, stamped with letters and numbers, and on the back, engraved in tiny print, a name. The chain had snapped years ago. She'd wrapped electrical tape around the break, then wrapped it again, then wrapped it once more. It didn't hold the weight right anymore. It would slip during compressions or when she leaned over a patient, and she would have to tuck it back down, feel the cool metal against her skin, and remember. The tag belonged to someone she had carried out of Tikrit in pieces. Not metaphorically. Literally. Her fire team leader. A man whose name she didn't speak aloud anymore, hadn't spoken in 4 years, wouldn't speak unless the sky fell and the Pentagon came calling. She wore the tag like a scar she kept in a place no one could see. The locker in the break room was hers. Third from the left on the bottom row. She kept it minimal, a change of clothes, a protein bar, a phone charger that had the corners worn off from being thrown in bags. On the inside of the door, tucked behind a small magnet, was a photograph. 2009, Tikrit. 5 people in desert camouflage, standing in front of a Humvee, weapons held low, eyes hard with the kind of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. She was in the middle, hair cut shorter then, face different, younger, but not younger. The photograph was faded, the edges soft from being handled. She closed the locker quickly whenever anyone came near. It wasn't paranoia. It was practice. It was the thing she had learned in the military and carried into civilian life like a weapon she wasn't supposed to mention. If people didn't know what you were, they couldn't take it away. Laura Bennett, the quiet nurse. That was the identity that worked. That was the identity that let her exist in the space between her past and whatever came next. The room went dead silent. Not the hallway. The actual room. The moment when someone realizes they've made a mistake and can't take it back. It was Friday, 2 weeks after Ashford's phone call to Peterson. Laura was stocking the trauma cart with fresh supplies, checking expiration dates, rotating stock, the kind of invisible work that kept the system functioning. She heard the footsteps before she registered who was walking. Ashford. Moving with purpose. His jaw set the way it had been when he'd watched her suture the college student. He stood in the doorway and didn't greet her. Just spoke. "There's a concern about your scope of practice," he said. His voice was clinical. Careful. The kind of voice that left room for the hospital to deny it had been malicious. "Patients in trauma too have been reporting that you performed assessments beyond nursing protocols." Laura didn't turn around. She continued organizing the 4 lines, 18 gauge on the left, 20 gauge in the middle, 22 gauge on the right. Everything in its place. Everything where it belonged. She had learned not to defend herself a long time ago. Defense implied guilt. It implied that the accusation mattered, that she cared about the outcome, that his words could move something inside her. They couldn't. "Which patients?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. Flat. The voice of someone reading from a checklist. "That's not the point," Ashford said. "The point is creating liability. The point is knowing your lane and staying in it." She didn't respond. She moved to the next shelf. Checked the defibrillator pads. Confirmed the medications were labeled and dated. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head, and in that buzz was all the noise of the world that didn't matter. Ashford was waiting for a reaction. A defense. An apology. Something he could use to justify the decision he'd already made. He got none of those things. What he got was Laura Bennett continuing to work, continuing to stock supplies, continuing to move through the trauma bay like he hadn't spoken at all. After 45 seconds, she counted them, Ashford left. His footsteps retreated down the hallway. And the room stayed silent except for the buzz of the lights and the distant sound of the monitor in Bay 3 registering a steady heartbeat. But that wasn't the worst part. What came next was worse because it was calculated. It was strategic. It was the kind of move that proved Ashford didn't just want her gone, he wanted her discredited. He wanted to make sure that when she left Cedar Creek Medical, she would carry the stain of incompetence with her, the question mark of liability, the shadow of having overstepped her place. He made phone calls. 3 of them. 1 to the hospital's medical director. 1 to human resources. 1 to his mentor at the state licensing board, a man he'd done fellowship with, a man who owed him favors, a man who could make inquiries that didn't need to be recorded. And he did it all with the kind of care a surgeon uses with a scalpel. Professional. Deniable. Devastating. Laura felt it before she understood it. The way conversations would stop when she entered a room. The way the resident stopped asking her opinion on procedures. The way the day shift charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who had worked with her for 8 months without incident, suddenly became formal. Distant. On Wednesday, Dr. Ashford scheduled a meeting with her in his office. That was the move that told her everything. The office. The closed door. The performance of authority. He was building a paper trail. He was documenting her insubordination so thoroughly that by the time she understood what was happening, there would be nothing left to defend. He would have testimony. He would have timestamps. He would have the institutional machinery of Cedar Creek Medical operating in his favor, and all she would have was the quiet certainty that she'd done nothing wrong. Which, in a hospital, meant nothing. She picked up the dog tag through the fabric of her scrubs, a habit, something she did without thinking. The metal was warm from her skin. The broken chain held it close. For years since Tikrit. For years since she'd worn a uniform that people recognized. For years since the word commander meant anything to anyone. Now she was little Laura. The quiet nurse. The one with the scarred hands and the careful movements and the reputation that was about to be systematically dismantled by a man who'd never looked danger in the face, who'd never had to make decisions where both choices ended in death, who'd never understood that there were kinds of competence that transcended credentials. She didn't need him to understand. She needed him to stay in his lane. And she was beginning to understand that he never would. The PA system crackled at 08 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the colonel arrived. Laura stood at the medication cart on the 3rd floor, cross-checking labels against the patient roster, her hands moving with the economy of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The speakers hummed their preliminary tone, that metallic whisper that made every nurse in the hospital pause. Little Laura to the supply closet. Little Laura to the supply closet. Dr. Ashford needs supplies organized. The phrase echoed through 3 floors. Radiology. ICU. The pediatric wing. Little Laura. Not Laura. Not Nurse Bennett. Little. 2 residents at the nurses' station smirked. One of them, a 3rd year named Morrison, actually laughed, a sharp bark that he tried to swallow. Nurse practitioner Chen looked away, suddenly fascinated by her computer screen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent witnesses. Laura's jaw set like stone, that familiar tightness spreading across her temples, but her breathing stayed even. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She set down the medication scanner with deliberate care, each movement precise and unhurried. Not rushed. Not defensive. Not broken. She walked to the supply closet on the 3rd floor, her steps measured, her spine straight, her face blank as fresh linen. The other nurses watched her go. They always did. The supply closet was a narrow space, barely 8 feet deep, lined with boxes of gauze and saline bags and replacement for pumps. Fluorescent strip lighting hummed from above. The air smelled of antiseptic and cardboard and the faint metallic tang of medical equipment. Laura pushed the door open and reached for the restocking clipboard, already knowing what was coming. Dr. Ashford was behind her before the door fully closed. She didn't flinch. That was the thing about combat experience, it trained you to feel threats the way some people felt temperature changes. His breathing came before his voice. His presence made the air pressure change. He stood 6 inches from her face, blocking the door, his white coat still sharp from the dry cleaners. His cologne was something expensive and aggressive, cutting through the antiseptic. Laura turned slowly to face him, her expression glacial, her dark eyes empty as a closed tomb. "You think you're special because the staff likes you." His voice came out low, controlled, which somehow made it worse than yelling. This was a man who understood leverage. "You're a nurse, Bennett. You follow orders." "My orders. Next time you bypass protocol, next time you think you're the attending, I'll have your license suspended before you can file a complaint. I have 3 board members on speed dial. I have friends at the state licensing board. Do we understand each other, little Laura?" His index finger came up, pointing at her sternum. Close enough that she could see the tremor in his hand, not fear. Rage. The controlled kind. The kind that had orchestrated this entire moment, the PA system, the audience, the degradation. He was competent about his cruelty. That was what made him genuinely dangerous. Laura stared at him without blinking. Her jaw remained set. Her hand stayed at her sides, steady as surgical steel. The cold flat stare was the only answer he was getting, and she held it long enough that she could see the calculation flickering behind his eyes. He wanted a reaction. A tremor. A cracked voice. An apology. Something he could use as proof that he'd broken her. She waited 2 beats after he finished. Silent. Still. Her breathing the only movement, controlled and measured. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quiet and surgical, every word a scalpel. "Is that meant to convince me or you, doctor?" Ashford's face flushed crimson, not a gradual warm-up but a sudden flood of color that started at his neck and climbed his jawline. His finger dropped. His breathing changed. She'd just demonstrated that his threat meant nothing, that his leverage was theoretical, that she was not the person he thought he was intimidating. Worse, she'd done it without raising her voice or showing fear. She'd done it with a single question that reframed his entire performance as desperation. "We're done here," she said, and stepped around him toward the door with the same measured pace she'd used walking in. Not fast. Not defiant. Just walking. The kind of calm that comes from having already walked through worse. Behind her, she heard him exhale, a sound between a hiss and a growl, but he didn't follow. The supply closet door swung shut on its pneumatic hinge, and Laura moved back to the medication cart on the 3rd floor with the same professional demeanor she'd shown 8 minutes earlier. The other nurses watched her return. Chen looked up, searching her face for some sign of damage. There was none. The evening shift rolled around with the usual chaos, 3 new admissions, a patient in 4B whose fever spiked to 104.2 and required cooling measures, a family member in the waiting room who wanted to argue about visiting hours. Laura worked through it with invisible competence, starting 4s, charting notes, checking oxygen saturation levels on the post-surgical patients. Around 1,730 hours, she went to her locker during handoff and found a small box already packed with her personal items, the chipped mug she drank coffee from, the succulent plant someone had given her 3 years ago that barely survived because she forgot to water it on weekends, a photo in a plastic frame. She stared at the box, already knowing what was about to happen. You didn't pack for someone unless you'd already decided they were leaving. Dr. Ashford appeared in the ambulance bay at 1,745 hours, right when the evening shift gathered for their briefing. Rain misted under the sodium lights, fine and cold, beading on the asphalt. The evening crew was all there: Chen, Morrison, the two LPNs, the respiratory therapist, a resident named Keller who'd shadowed Laura on 3 separate codes. 12 people. Witnesses. An audience. "Bennett, you're off charge nurse rotation," Ashford announced, his voice carrying across the bay with the precision of someone who'd been waiting to deliver this line. "Effective immediately. You lack the leadership maturity this department requires. Chen will take your shifts." Rain continued to fall. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sound of it hitting the bay doors was like applause. Laura stood with her box of belongings pressed against her side, the weight of it almost nothing, a decade of professional presence compressed into cardboard and memory. She looked at Ashford for exactly 3 seconds, then at Chen, then at each of the others in sequence. Morrison couldn't meet her eyes. The respiratory therapist looked furious. Keller's jaw had gone tight. "Noted," Laura said, and turned toward the staff entrance. Behind her, she heard Ashford's breathing normalize, heard the small triumphant exhale that came from someone who believed he'd just won. What he didn't see was the way Laura's left hand moved to her chest, to the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the one on the broken chain that had belonged to someone else once, someone she'd carried out of a burning building in pieces. What he didn't see was the way her eyes went somewhere far from Savannah, to a place where the rules were different and the consequences were permanent. The rain soaked through her scrubs as she walked toward her car. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0230 hours on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks later, the ambulance bay doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man in a flight suit, his chest torn open by 5 separate puncture wounds, his breathing coming in desperate, shallow gasps that sounded like something breaking. The ambulance bay doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man in a flight suit, his chest torn open by 5 separate puncture wounds, his breathing coming in desperate, shallow gasps that sounded like something breaking. The trauma alert echoed through Cedar Creek Medical's intercom system at 02 for 7 hours. Air Force Colonel James Mercer. 5 GSWs, 2 collapsed lungs, approximately 10 minutes of viable perfusion remaining if they moved fast. If they moved perfectly. The stretcher clattered through the automatic doors and the ER team materialized around it like iron filings to a magnet, residents calling out vitals, nurses cutting away the flight suit, the attending physician barking orders that nobody was quite following because the injury pattern didn't make sense and the bleeding wouldn't slow. Dr. Ashford was in his office on the 2nd floor, reviewing the quarterly staffing variance report with the kind of meticulous attention he'd learned from his mentor on the state licensing board. The man had called 3 minutes ago, just to check in. "How's your little problem resolving?" Dr. Ashford had smiled at that, at the understanding that some problems required the right kind of pressure applied from the right kind of directions. He heard the trauma alert broadcast through the ceiling speaker and felt a small surge of satisfaction. Let the floor nurses scramble. Let them see what happened when they didn't follow his protocols, when they got too confident in their own judgment. He would finish this report. The hospital would function better with clear hierarchies, with knowledge of who wielded the actual authority. Laura was in bay for restocking supplies when the stretcher arrived, her hands moving through the muscle memory of organization, sterile field kits to the left, decompression needles in ascending gauge size to the right, airway equipment staged behind her in the order it would likely be needed. She had done this before. Not here. Not in Savannah. But her hands remembered the sequence, the preparation, the way you arranged your world so that when chaos arrived, you didn't have to think. You just moved. The trauma alert sounded and she turned toward the bay doors and what she saw made her entire nervous system shift into a different frequency. The colonel's chest was rising and falling in that wrong way, the way that meant his lungs weren't inflating, the way that meant his body was slowly suffocating while his heart still pumped. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis was written in the architecture of his breathing, in the pale gray color of his skin, in the way his body was already starting to shut down. The attending resident was frozen. Actually frozen, one hand extended toward the patient, the other holding a clipboard, his mouth moving but no actual words emerging. The chest wasn't expanding properly. The breath sounds on the left side were absent. The pressure inside his thorax was mounting with every breath, pushing his mediastinum toward the right, collapsing everything in its path. Laura moved past him like he was furniture. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand before anyone asked for it, the alcohol wipe already prepped, her fingers finding the anatomical landmark, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, right side. One swift motion. The needle punched through skin and ribs and visceral pleura, and then something released. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a sigh, like relief, like a man getting his lungs back. The colonel's eyes snapped open and he gasped, actually gasped, his body remembering how to pull oxygen into living tissue. "Left side," she said. Her voice carried no question in it. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered by someone whose hands were already moving, already prepping the second needle, already finding the landmark on the opposite side. Intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle went in and another hiss escaped, and the colonel's oxygen saturation began its climb, 75, 82, 88. One of the residents finally moved, actually moved, and began cutting larger access points for chest tubes. Laura stepped back and assessed. The breathing was still labored, but it was breathing. The color was still wrong, but it wasn't getting wronger. "Get me 2 units, O negative, and push 1 milligram epi 4, she said to the nurse beside her. The nurse didn't hesitate. Nobody hesitated after that. Something had shifted in the room. The attending resident was already calling surgery. Someone was running blood. Someone else was establishing a second large-bore 4 line and running wide-open fluids through a rapid infuser. The colonel was still alive because of the 5 seconds where Laura didn't wait for authorization. The next 4 hours and 55 minutes belonged entirely to the colonel's vital signs and Laura's hands. She titrated the vasopressors with the kind of precision that made manual adjustments look like art, increasing the norepinephrine drip by 0.01 micrograms per kilogram, watching his pressure respond, watching his perfusion improve, making infinitesimal corrections that kept him from bottoming out or spiking dangerously high. The ventilator settings needed adjustment every 20 minutes as his lung compliance changed. She modified the PEEP, adjusted the tidal volumes, monitored his arterial blood gas values coming back from the lab. His hemoglobin dropped through the second hour and she ordered transfusions, hanging units of packed RBCs and watching his oxygen carrying capacity improve with each bag. The monitor beeped its rhythmic pulse and she listened to it the way some people listen to their own heartbeat, without thinking, just knowing if the cadence changed. At hour 2, Dr. Ashford made his first phone call from his office. The medical director's secretary connected him immediately because that's what happened when you had the right contacts. "I need to document a scope of practice concern," Ashford said smoothly. "There's a nurse in the ER who performed needle decompression without physician authorization. I'm concerned about patient safety implications and liability. I wanted to flag it for the medical director's attention." The medical director had taken his position 6 months ago and was still learning the political landscape of Cedar Creek. He thanked Dr. Ashford for bringing this to his attention. He said he'd look into it. He meant well. He had no idea that Dr. Ashford had already won. In the ICU, Laura sat at the bedside and watched the colonel's numbers. His systolic pressure held at 110. His oxygen saturation climbed to 94. The trauma surgeon came by at hour 3 and paused in the doorway, just watching. He was a man named Chen, 47 years old, 23 years of emergency medicine, and he'd seen enough nurse-physician interactions to recognize competence when it stood in front of him. "You've done this before," he said quietly. "Not a question." Laura didn't answer. She adjusted the dopamine drip by another 0.02 micrograms per kilogram, watched the pressure response on the monitor, and nodded. The monitor beeped. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, keeping the colonel alive 1 breath at a time. At hour 3 and 15 minutes, Dr. Ashford made his second call. "This time to HR, I need to file a formal complaint about scope of practice violations," he said. "The nurse in question has been performing medical procedures without authorization. I have documentation and multiple witness statements. I'm concerned this represents a pattern of insubordination and patient safety negligence. HR opened a file. A case number was assigned. The machinery of institutional investigation began to turn. Laura didn't know any of this. She was concentrating on the colonel's left lung compliance, which was improving but still marginal. She was watching for signs of reaccumulation in the pneumothorax, watching his central venous pressure, watching the clock. 5 hours was the turning point. If he made 5 hours, his body would stabilize enough that the surgical repair would hold. If he didn't, if his pressure crashed or his lungs gave up or his heart decided that 5 gunshot wounds was enough, then all of this, the needle decompression, the transfusions, the vasopressor titration, would have just been prolonging the inevitable. But he was holding. The monitors showed holding vitals. His pressure was stable. His oxygenation was acceptable. The residents had stopped moving frantically and started moving with purpose. Someone had brought coffee. Someone else was actually eating a granola bar. The crisis was becoming manageable. At hour 4, Dr. Ashford made his third call. This time to his mentor on the state licensing board, a retired Air Force surgeon named General Pierce who had taught him everything he knew about climbing hierarchies and accumulating the kind of favor debt that could be called in years later. I need your opinion on something, Ashford said. I have a nurse who I believe is practicing medicine without a license. Specifically, needle decompression for tension pneumothorax. I'm worried about the legal implications for the hospital and I'm wondering if you might want to look into her record. General Pierce listened. He made notes. He said this sounded like something that warranted investigation. He said he had friends in the licensing board. He said he'd make some calls. He didn't ask for any context beyond that. Context didn't matter when you had leverage. What mattered was the phone call being made, the machinery being activated, the slow, inevitable gears of institutional power turning against a single person in a hospital ICU. At hour 4:30, 2 security officers in blue uniforms appeared at the ICU entrance. They were not unkind men. They were simply men doing a job, following orders from administration, and they had no idea that they were walking into a scene where a nurse had just, single-handedly, brought a dying man back from the brink. Ms. Bennett, one of them said. His name tag read Morrison. He was sorry, his expression conveyed, but there were allegations that had been made, questions that needed to be asked, and he was going to need her to step away from patient care pending investigation. Laura looked at the monitor. The colonel's pressure was holding at 110. His oxygen saturation was 94. His heart rate was 82 and steady. She looked at the attending resident. Titrate the dopamine down slowly, she said. Watch his BP. If he drops below 90, push 500 of phenylephrine. Adjust vent settings if his compliance changes. His left lung is still marginal. The resident nodded. He understood. He would maintain the line. Laura stood and walked to the locker room with the 2 security officers following behind her, and she changed out of her scrubs with the same methodical care she'd applied to the colonel's care. Each movement precise. Each movement controlled. By hour 5, she stood at a rain-soaked bus stop on Whitaker Street with a cardboard box on her hip. Inside, a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent in a ceramic pot, and a photograph of her fire team from Tikrit. 5 faces staring back at the camera on a day in 2009 when none of them had expected to become memories. One of those faces was hers. 3 of the others belonged to men who died in the next 18 months. The rain hammered the pavement like applause for something she'd done wrong, something she'd failed at, something that had cost people their lives and taught her that second chances were for people who hadn't already used up their one good life. She was getting on this bus. She was leaving Savannah the same way she'd entered it, quietly, competently, with nothing but the weight of her past and a dog tag on a broken chain. The bus pulled up. The doors opened. And in the circular driveway of Cedar Creek Medical, approximately 300 yards away and entirely invisible to her at this moment, 3 black SUVs with government plates turned in through the main entrance. Hour 4 of the ICU shift, and the colonel's numbers were holding. 72 systolic. Oxygen saturation steady at 94% on the ventilator. 2 units of packed red cells running in parallel, vasopressor drip titrated to the milliliter. Laura stood at the bedside doing what she'd done in Tikrit, holding the line between alive and not. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, checking pressures, reading the ventilator waveforms, adjusting the sedation drip because pain was information and every number told a story. She didn't notice the phone buzzing in Dr. Ashford's pocket as he stood outside the unit, watching her work. The first call went to Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Cedar Creek's medical director, at 18:47 hours. Ashford's voice came out smooth, practiced, concerned. "Marcus, I need to flag something. The trauma nurse in bed 7, Laura, she performed a procedure she's not credentialed for. Bilateral needle decompression. That's physician scope. I was washing my hands when she took the initiative." Whitmore listened. Ashford continued, each word placed like a tile in a path. "I'm not saying she didn't save his life. I'm saying we have liability if she's working outside her training. Documentation's already in the system. Could create problems during review." Whitmore said he'd look into it. Ashford thanked him and hung up. The second call went to HR at 19:03 hours. This time Ashford's tone carried a different weight, concerned administrator, protecting the institution. "I'm calling about Laura Bennett, ICU staff. This is sensitive. She performed an advanced procedure without physician authorization during the colonel's resuscitation. I documented it. My concern is she may have a pattern of scope creep. I want to be thorough before this becomes an incident report." The HR director asked if the patient was harmed. "No," Ashford said. "But that's luck, not protocol." He waited. "I think we need to have a conversation with her, and I wanted leadership aware first." The third call, at 19:24 hours, went to his mentor on the state nursing board, a retired surgeon named Dr. William Terhune who'd written Ashford's medical school recommendation 15 years ago. Ashford's voice dropped, almost conspiratorial. "Bill, I need some advice. Colleague of mine, ICU nurse, performed an unsupervised procedure. Tension pneumothorax decompression. Textbook scope violation. I documented everything, but I'm worried about our liability if we don't address it immediately. What's the standard?" Terhune said scope violations were serious. Ashford agreed. "I'm not trying to ruin anyone's career. I just need this handled correctly." Terhune told him to escalate to administration. Ashford said he already had. By 19:45 hours, Ashford had constructed a narrative so airtight it barely required embellishment, the heroic doctor, concerned about protocol, protecting the institution. The calls created a chain of institutional concern. Whitmore mentioned it to the compliance officer. HR flagged it in the system. By hour 4, when Laura stood adjusting the propofol drip while the colonel's cardiac rhythm stayed steady as a metronome, the machinery of bureaucracy had already begun its inexorable turn. Security arrived at 20:12 hours. 2 officers in polo shirts with Cedar Creek Medical patches, looking uncomfortable. They approached the ICU from the south entrance, and the charge nurse noticed them first, saw who they were looking for, and her face went pale. Laura was checking the arterial line readings when the older officer appeared at the bedside. "Ms. Bennett? You need to step away from the patient." "Not a request." Laura didn't move. "Now." The younger officer positioned himself between her and the monitor bank. Laura set down the monitor stylus with the same careful precision she'd used to perform the needle decompression. She didn't rush. She didn't look angry. She looked at the colonel, still unconscious, still holding, still breathing on the machine she'd configured to keep him alive, and then she turned to the officer. "His vasopressor is titrated to systolic 72, she said. "If you decrease the drip, his pressure will tank. His kidney function is borderline. He needs 65 ml per hour on the regular for, not more, not less." His next blood draw is in 40 minutes. He'll need 2 more units of packed cells before morning. The officer shifted his weight. That's not our concern. Laura's jaw set like stone. It is now. She stepped away from the bed. The second officer took her elbow, gently, but firm. The charge nurse was already on the phone with the attending, her voice shaking. We have a staffing issue in ICU. Laura Bennett's being escorted out on Ashford's authority. I don't have scope to countermand it. The attending was silent for 3 seconds. Who's covering the colonel? No one could answer that. Laura walked out of the unit at 2014 hours, and the room she'd been holding together with precision and will began to fragment behind her. The rain in Savannah comes sideways when it comes hard, and it was coming hard at 2047 hours when Laura stood at the bus stop on Victory Drive, 3 blocks from Cedar Creek. The cardboard box she'd filled with her belongings was already soft at the corners, a cracked mug with a Marine Corps emblem, a dying succulent with brown edges, her hospital ID that would be deactivated by morning. She wore scrub soaked through, her hair plastered to her neck. The rain hammered the box like it had a personal vendetta, and she didn't move from it, didn't angle it away or pull it under a shelter that was visible 30 feet to her left. She just stood there with the box on her hip like a pilgrim carrying the last thing she owned in the world. Tucked in a zippered side pocket of her bag was a photograph, 11 years old, the edges already curling and fading. Her fire team from Tikrit. Sergeant Robert Chen, Navy Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class, grinning at the camera with his arm around her shoulders, both of them covered in dust the color of dried blood. Robert in his corpsman's rig. Laura in her flak jacket. Behind them, the dust-hazed outline of FOB Shank, and somewhere beyond that, the city where she'd carried his body 400 meters under direct fire and then watched him die anyway. The rain found the photograph through a rupture in the cardboard, and the edges began to run, the blue of his uniform bleeding into the tan of the dust, his smile dissolving into streaks of water and age. Laura watched it happen and didn't reach for it. Some things were meant to be washed away. The bus was 7 minutes late, and in those 7 minutes, the rain shifted from punishment to something almost gentle. Laura's scrubs dripped steadily onto the cracked concrete. A car passed on Victory Drive, its headlights cutting through the downpour, and she didn't look at it. She was looking through the rain-streaked shelter panels toward Cedar Creek Medical, visible in the distance like a low ship on the horizon, when 3 vehicles turned through its main entrance. Black. Government plates. Moving with the kind of purpose that made even the rain seem to part for them. 3 black SUVs with LED light bars that weren't activated, rolling through the circular drive like they'd been expected, like they knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they'd find. Laura didn't move toward the hospital. She didn't move toward the bus stop shelter. She stood in the rain with the disintegrating box on her hip and watched the vehicles disappear under the portico. Something in her ribs tightened, not fear, but recognition. That particular kind of movement. That specific formation. Military precision in a civilian vehicle. She'd seen that pattern before, in different rain, in a different country, 11 years ago. She waited. The bus appeared in the distance, amber brake lights cut through the downpour. She should board it. She should leave Savannah the way she'd left every other place, quietly, completely, without looking back. The bus was 2 blocks away now, 1 block. The rain kept falling. Her hand went up to where the dog tag used to rest, the chain already broken, the metal already taken as evidence, and she was reaching for the bus door when she stopped. Through the rain-streaked glass of the shelter, she could see the hospital entrance. A Marine captain stood there, dress blues despite the weather, dress uniform taking rain like a ceremony. Then another. Then a 2-star general with shoulders full of ribbons she could read even from this distance, silver stars, bronze stars, ribbons for service she knew how to interpret because she'd earned most of them herself. The general stood looking up at the hospital, and the rain fell on his cover, and he didn't move to brush it away. Laura's breath came out slow. Measured. The bus pulled up to the stop, its air brakes hissing like a creature waking up. The doors opened. The driver looked at her, soaked, with a falling-apart box, and then at the hospital, where 3 vehicles had just delivered what looked like half the Pentagon's dress uniform inventory. "You getting on?" the driver asked. Laura looked at the hospital. She looked at the bus. She looked at her hands, still dry despite the rain, and at the box falling apart in her arms. 27 years of holding things together. Carrying bodies. Keeping people alive when everything else had given up. Walking away from every version of herself she'd ever been. And now 3 black SUVs had arrived at exactly the moment she was about to board a bus to nowhere, driven by someone who was asking a simple question, "You getting on?" Laura Bennett set the cardboard box down on the metal bench. She turned away from the bus. She walked back into the rain toward Cedar Creek Medical, her scrub soaked and clinging, her shoes leaving wet prints on the sidewalk that the rain was already erasing, toward the lobby where a Marine captain was asking the receptionist for her name, toward the moment when everything she'd buried was about to come unburied, and she didn't know whether she was walking into salvation or catastrophe, only that she was moving toward it with the absolute certainty of someone who'd learned long ago. That standing still was the only way to disappear. The bus doors hissed shut behind her. The driver waited 3 seconds, saw she wasn't coming back, and pulled into traffic. By the time Laura reached the hospital entrance, her heart was moving at 112 beats per minute, a tachycardia she'd learned to control, a physical response she could measure and regulate like a monitored patient's vitals. She pushed through the ER entrance, water streaming from her scrubs, and saw them in the lobby like a constellation of dress blue uniforms and polished insignia. The general was still looking up at the ceiling, as if he could see through it to the ICU above. One of the Marine captains turned and saw her. His eyes went wide. He didn't speak. He just walked forward until he was standing 3 feet from this wet, disheveled trauma nurse, and he saluted. Full military bearing. Fist to chest. The kind of salute you give to an officer. To someone you know. To someone you've been looking for. 30 minutes after they escorted Laura out of the ICU, the colonel's eyes opened. Not slowly. Not the confused flutter of sedation lifting. Wide. Alert. Aware. The attending nurse beside him, a competent woman named Sanders who'd worked nights for 7 years, was adjusting the ventilator when she noticed his hand moving. Fingers curling. Jaw working beneath the endotracheal tube. He couldn't speak. The tube was in. But his lips formed a word anyway, shape after desperate shape, silent but unmistakable. Phantom. Sanders leaned closer. "Colonel? Can you hear me?" His eyes locked onto hers, and tears spilled down the sides of his face. Not weak tears. Not confusion. The kind of tears that come from finding something you'd lost hope of ever seeing again. "Your nurse," Sanders said slowly. "The one who saved you. She's—" But she didn't finish, because the elevator doors on the 3rd floor opened and boots hit the tile. Not hospital staff. Military cadence. For personnel in dress blues that caught the fluorescent light like polished steel, 2 Marine captains with the bearing of men who'd made career decisions with their hands, a Navy commander whose ribbons climbed his chest in a color-coded biography of 30 years at war, and a 2-star general whose silver stars caught the light like warnings. They moved through Cedar Creek's lobby with the kind of purpose that made civilians step aside. Not aggressive. Worse, indifferent to whether anyone got out of the way or not. The front desk erupted. A receptionist made a phone call. Someone whispered. The general didn't slow. His name was Marcus Halloway. His last combat command had been Kandahar province. Before that, Yemen. Before that, classified. He carried himself like someone who'd walked through worse than a small hospital in Savannah and found nothing particularly frightening about it. Security tried to intercept at the information desk. The Navy commander, a man whose name tag read Graves, simply said, "Stand down, son. This is federal." They were waiting in the hospital lobby when the medical director arrived, breathless, his Tuesday destroyed. The general didn't extend his hand. Didn't introduce himself. Instead, he looked directly at the director and said, "You had a nurse." You fired her today. I need everything connected to that termination, and I need it now. The director's face went the color of institutional mediocrity painted beige. What they didn't know was what security had already confiscated during Laura's removal from the ICU, the dog tag on the broken chain, pulled from beneath her scrubs during the escort, bagged as evidence of some violation nobody could quite articulate. That bag was in security's office. The general asked for it. Security retrieved it. And when Holloway opened that plastic evidence bag, when his fingers touched that tarnished metal disc and turned it over in the hospital light, his jaw tightened in a way that made the two captains step closer. The name was engraved on both sides. Laura Michelle Bennett. And beneath it, in smaller text, Phantom Actual, 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company, Naval Special Operations. The general's eyes closed. One of the captains stepped forward, a woman named Reeves whose combat record included a Bronze Star and a reputation for being the kind of quiet that meant she'd seen things worse than most people's nightmares. She pulled a folded document from her service dress blue jacket. The citation. The one that had been waiting in a secure Pentagon file for 6 months, pending clearance protocols and family notification. Commander Laura Michelle Bennett, Reeves read, and her voice carried the cadence of official ceremony, for extraordinary heroism under fire while serving as a combat medic with Naval Special Operations Element in Tikrit, Iraq. On March 14, 2017, while leading an ambush defense and suppressing enemy fire, Commander Bennett administered emergency medical treatment to 4 wounded personnel under sustained hostile fire. When a 5th team member became critically wounded from multiple gunshot wounds, Commander Bennett exposed herself to direct fire to transport that casualty to cover, rendering emergency medical care while returning fire. Her actions resulted in the survival of all 5 wounded personnel and the successful exfiltration of her entire element. The reading was flawless. Professional. The lobby had gone so quiet that the fluorescent lights hummed like they were the only sound left in the world. That's when Dr. Ashford came through the stairwell door. Red face didn't cover it. His skin had gone past crimson into a shade of apoplexy that made one of the captains instinctively position himself between Ashford and the general. Ashford didn't notice. He was moving toward the gathering, his voice already climbing. I can explain what happened. That nurse exceeded her scope of practice. She interfered with the treatment protocol. She was terminated for cause under hospital policy. There was no negligence here. The patient was stabilized. The colonel is alive because of proper emergency procedure, not because of... The general turned. Slowly. The kind of movement that made the air pressure change. He was holding the dog tag. And when General Marcus Holloway, a man who'd commanded 2,000 personnel across 3 continents, who'd made decisions that altered the course of military operations, who'd lost friends in theaters he couldn't discuss, stepped toward Ashford and brought his right hand up in a salute, it wasn't informal. It was the kind of salute that acknowledged rank and service and sacrifice. The kind of salute that carried the weight of institutional respect meeting institutional reality. The dog tag caught the light between them. Ashford's mouth opened. No sound came out. You've terminated a Naval Special Operations commander for saving a man's life, Holloway said quietly. The same commander who lost 15 liters of blood in a combat zone and never quit. Who carried out casualties when she was hemorrhaging from multiple gunshot wounds because her team came before her own survival. The hospital director's face had gone the color of institutional liability. That's impossible, Ashford managed. She's a nurse. She was a medic, maybe, but she's a nurse here, Anne. She's a commander, Reeves interrupted. Her voice was flat. Surgical. Your problem isn't with a nurse. Your problem is with the Pentagon. At that exact moment, 9:06 p.m. on a Tuesday that nobody working at Cedar Creek Medical would ever forget, a video began circulating on social media. Shot on an iPhone by a resident named Martinez who'd stood in the ambulance bay watching it happen, unable to stop it. 34 seconds of footage that would eventually reach 400,000 people before anyone at the hospital even knew it existed. Dr. Ashford screaming at Laura in the rain-soaked parking lot. His face twisted with rage. Her face completely still, jaw set, eyes forward, water streaming off her scrubs. The cardboard box disintegrating in her hands. Her meager possessions, the cracked coffee mug, the dying succulent, the photograph of her fire team from Tikrit, hitting the wet asphalt. The caption, typed in all caps, "Our chief of emergency medicine just fired the nurse who saved a dying patient. Share this." By 10:15 p.m., it had 17,000 views. By midnight, 200,000. By 3 a.m., the hospital's phone lines had melted. Messages poured in from across the country. Veterans. Combat medics. Nurses who recognized something in Laura's stillness, not weakness, but the kind of composure that came from having already survived the unsurvivable. News outlets started calling. A trauma surgeon from Johns Hopkins released a statement. Then another from Walter Reed. Then, and this was the moment that ended Dr. Ashford's career in a single paragraph, a statement from a retired Army surgeon whose name was on the state licensing board, whose son had been a corpsman in Iraq, whose son's last letter home had talked about an angel who wouldn't quit, an officer who bled with us and got back up. Dr. Raymond Chen. Ashford's own mentor. The man who'd written Ashford's recommendation letter to Johns Hopkins. The man who'd guided his career for 15 years. Released a public statement disowning him. Dr. Robert Ashford has betrayed the fundamental oath we take as physicians, Chen's statement read. He weaponized institutional power against a decorated combat veteran for the crime of saving a human life. He is not fit to practice medicine. I am petitioning the state licensing board for immediate review and suspension of his credentials. What happened at Cedar Creek Medical is not medicine. It is persecution of a hero by a coward. The board convened in 72 hours. They reviewed the video. They reviewed the citation. They reviewed testimony from the colonel himself, who sat up in his hospital bed and looked directly at the investigative panel and said, "Commander Bennett is the reason I'm alive." Twice, once in the ambush, once in that ER. She's the most qualified person I've ever known. The suspension was unanimous. Dr. Ashford's credentials were frozen pending full investigation. The hospital terminated him for cause that afternoon. His employment file now contained a video of him screaming at a wounded veteran in the rain. His mentor had disowned him publicly. Medical schools began using his case as an ethics lesson in what happens when ego overtakes competence. But none of that mattered to Laura because while Dr. Ashford was learning what institutional collapse felt like, she was receiving a phone call from the VA's Director of Trauma Medicine. "Commander Bennett," a voice said. "We've been authorized to offer you the position of Chief Medical Officer for a new trauma program we're building in Savannah. Full federal funding. State-of-the-art equipment. 20 personnel. Complete autonomy." She was quiet for a long moment. "I need you to understand something," the voice continued. "The Pentagon doesn't forget people like you. Neither does this country. Not anymore." Laura's hands, the ones that had held lives together in a war zone, the ones that had performed needle decompression at 2 a.m. in a civilian ER, the ones that had been stripped of everything by a man terrified of what he didn't understand, those hands accepted. The VA trauma program opened 6 months later in a new wing of Cedar Creek Medical. The plaque by the entrance read, "Commander Laura Bennett, USN, Ret, Chief Medical Officer." The Phantom of Tikrit had come home. If you ever question whether the quiet people in the room might be the ones holding it all together, this is your answer. Subscribe for more stories about the ones nobody noticed until the world did. Hit like. Tell us in the comments, would you have walked away, or would you have saved him?